Okay, the next speaker is going to be Trish Groves. Trish is deputy editor and editor of BMJ Open, and I think she's going to talk about some of the new initiatives at the BMJ group.
It's funny, I mean, normally when we come and give talks, we try very hard to be very, as general as possible and not promote our own products. And yet in this session, we've been asked to talk about our own journals, so I feel slightly uncomfortable. But as we're all doing it, that's okay, I hope. So I do wear two hats. I'm one of the deputy editors at the BMJ, British Medical Journal, and there I'm responsible for the publication of research, and I manage the team that does all the outreach to researchers, trying to build research capacity in various parts of the world and attract great papers to the BMJ. But today I'm talking about BMJ Open. This is a journal that's just 2 years old and just published its thousandth manuscript. And we launched it in February 2011 in order to capture research that we weren't capturing elsewhere amongst the now 56 journals that the BMJ Publishing Group publishes. So we wanted to capture papers that perhaps had been submitted to one of our journals, hadn't made it, and we wanted to still provide a peer review service and a place to publish research. And we also wanted to try and attract papers that perhaps were confirmatory or perhaps more locally relevant in parts of the world where authors are very keen to publish in international journals but don't always get the chance to do that. And most importantly, we wanted to be very open. In the BMJ, all the research is openly accessible. It's full gold, as they call it, open access publishing, where we do levy article processing fees, but we waive them if the authors are not funded. BMJ Open, I'm going to talk about the lessons we've learned from going fully open in several different ways. So here we go. So again, I feel kind of weird telling you about this in what feels a rather promotional way, but here we go. So that's BMJ Open. It's an open access journal. It just publishes research papers and protocols. So if you want to think of an analogy, think PLOS One just medicine, because PLOS One is the whole of medicine and science. That's perhaps one way of thinking of it. So we have open peer review, and we're also very keen on the sharing of raw or supplementary data, which people have been struggling to get authors to do for clinical and epidemiological studies. I mentioned there that we have this sort of cascade system, so it's possible if you're submitting to any of the BMJ journals to say, all right, I'd like to try this one first, but if no luck there, can you pass the paper and any peer reviewers' reports on to this one and then that one? It saves you some bother, and it means that we're not completely losing work that does deserve publication. That doesn't mean to say that BMJ Open publishes everything. At the moment, our acceptance rate, well, over the past 2 years, has bumped along at about 60%. I'd be worried if it went a lot higher. This is not vanity publishing. We are rejecting 40% of the submissions to BMJ Open. On the BMJ and many general medical journals that are traditional, big, with high impact factors, we're talking maybe 6 or 7% acceptance rate. So you can see kind of where this journal sits. It's indexed. We're getting our first impact factor this coming summer. So I mentioned that we publish all kinds of papers, but just for this crowd, I wanted to point out that we have published quite a lot of systematic reviews, Cochrane reviews, and so on. And we've also published some quite controversial stuff, which has had a huge amount of coverage and downloads and so on. So this is by some of the authors involved in this conference. First author here is Carl Hennigan. And so this is how the paper looks in the PDF, but as you can see from the title, it was about the evidence underpinning sports performance products. And it's, as of this week, been downloaded. Well, the full text has been downloaded 12,000 times, the PDF and the abstract in addition to that. It got picked up here. This is the New York Times wellness blog, Well blog, I think it's called, and a lot of different places. So we're pleased to be publishing a whole range of different studies, including almost investigative sort of studies like this. So I was asked to talk about lessons. Well, one of them is that open peer review works. On the BMJ, we have a form of open peer review where for many years now we've asked all reviewers to sign their reports. So if your paper is submitted to the BMJ and it's sent for peer review, you will know who reviewed your paper and they will know who you were. But that information is not made public if we publish the paper. On BMJ Open, every single paper, every one of those 1,000, slightly more than 1,000 now, manuscripts, has been published with the original submitted version next to it and the peer reviewers' reports and the authors' responses to that. All signed, all open, all visible. And other journals have struggled to do this. So this is what we ask of reviewers. So I'll just let you read that. You can read. And like some of the other big open access journals, we don't ask reviewers to say, is this, you know, the most important thing you've read recently on your topic? Is it terribly original? Is it for a particular audience? We're asking reviewers to say, is the science okay? And then we work with the authors, if the science is okay, to make sure that it's very transparently reported, warts and all. Every paper has some warts, and we're very keen to make those obvious. So when you go to BMJ Open, you'll see the abstract, and right next to it, sort of above the fold, if you like, on the website, you'll see a list that includes the limitations. So you don't have to dig around in the paper to find what the limitations may be. I don't expect you to read this, don't worry, but it's just to say, for this paper here, which is what it says, it's looking at the difference between self-reported and verified adverse cardiovascular events in a trial. We just published this. Up here is the information I told you about. So the arrow up there shows the first review with the reviewer's name and then their comments, and there are other reviews there, and then the second arrow shows you the author's response to that. And you may think, why the hell would anyone want to read all that? But we're amazed of the which I should know the numbers, but there've been, you know, oh, I actually should know the numbers, but it's certainly millions of hits on BMJ Open, but a large proportion of them, much larger than we would expect, is to this material. People are interested in the peer reviewers' reports. Now, they might be because they're going, how the hell did that get published? Well, okay, you can see how it got published, and if you disagree, come and send an e-letter, and let's have that debate, and let's have the post-publication review carrying on after the paper has been published. And that's going pretty well too, the post-publication review debate. But equally, this does give reviewers visibility, which they often don't get. You know, how many of you are peer reviewers? Hands up. One form or another, grant review, paper, yeah, so most of you. And are you doing that in your own time? Are you doing it for love? Are you doing it for very little credit? Well, this is a chance for you to get some visibility and some credit, but it also makes you accountable. You can't do this in secret. You have to, you know, be prepared to stand up for what you said. So the other lesson, I won't go on too long, but this one is about sharing data. So I hope that those of you who are in the plenary sessions this morning who are interested in sharing clinical data, this is something which we're having some success with on BMJ Open, and we're very pleased about that, and we want to extend it. A lot of journals encourage authors or even mandate data sharing, but they do shy away for doing that with clinical studies. So if it's a lab study, no problem, you're expected to make, you know, effectively your notebooks available somewhere online, preferably with a link from the journal. But those journals actually don't put their foot down and insist on it with clinical studies for reasons which we'll talk about in a minute. But we found that it is feasible. So there are lots and lots and lots of things I could have said. We could talk all day about the reasons for sharing clinical data, but you heard many of the speakers this morning giving a good idea of why it's something we'd like to move towards. This is quite a nice summary. Sorry, I've broken the rules of how many things to put on a slide, but I hope it's reasonably clear. And this is from the UK Data Archive, which produced a very good report on managing and sharing data for researchers back in 2011. So again, I'll just let you have a look at that. The figure in the corner is not a football, it's a figure from that report, and it's meant to be something to do with data driving science forwards. I'm not sure if that entirely works, but there we are. So those are important reasons. I made just very slightly bigger. This one here can provide direct credit as a research output in its own right. And that is important, actually. You know, it's just as important if you make your data available either completely publicly somewhere on the web or perhaps on a website where it's password protected and people have to submit a proposal to a committee in order to get access to the data, or even on request. you ought to be credited with doing that and with making your data available in a usable form. So make sure you put that stuff on your CV if you're doing it. Actually, equally, if you're doing peer review and you get published in a journal like BMJ Open where your reviews are visible and they've got URLs, I would put those on my CV too, or at least I'd give some examples. Okay, a little bit more. We're encouraging people to share their data anywhere and anyhow. So every article in BMJ Open, actually this is also the case in the BMJ, every research paper has to include a data sharing statement. And you can pick words along these lines. The bits in square brackets are sort of either or. Equally, you can say, data sharing statement, we're not sharing any data. But at least we made you think about it and we made you make an explicit statement about it. So a lot of papers say that. We have so far actually helped the publication of 34 data sets linked to BMJ Open articles. Well, we've published 1,000 articles, so that's not a great hit rate, but it's better than any other medical journal that we're aware of. So it's a start. The other authors have said, you know, contact us and we'll give you the data on request. But most have said, no, we won't. But we, as I say, we just getting people to think about it is the first hurdle. We're making data sharing fairly simple by working with a digital repository called Dryad, which is there specially to share additional data or raw data from published journal articles. So this is not an institutional repository where you can go and put articles. This is something which hooks up with journal articles, and it provides DOIs, digital object identifiers, so that those data sets are themselves searchable, findable, easily accessible. And they're published with open access with no restrictions at all using this license. Ginny is going to tell you more about licensing in her talk. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? Fine. Good, okay. So that's what we're encouraging, but if you were submitting to BMJ Open and you wanted to send your data somewhere else, that's fine too. We're not prescribing that. Other journals are working with Dryad, PLOS is, and so are others. And I should have mentioned actually that some of the Biomed Central journals use open peer review, like I mentioned earlier, with the signed reviews posted next to the articles. That's not going to show up brilliantly, but I just wanted to show you the current, it's a screenshot of, from yesterday of the data sets that we've currently got in BMJ Open. So I said there are 34, that's the first page. And oh look, Carl Hennigan's the author of the top one there, and Tom Jefferson's the second one. We're not just getting our friends to deposit their data, I promise, but they're people who are interested in doing this kind of thing. So when they publish a paper with us, we say, well, are you going to share your data? And they can hardly say no, can they? So, and here again, I'm sorry, this is not great with, you never know what the screen's going to be like and what the lighting's going to be like when you prepare slides. But it's just an example of a BMJ Open paper with a data set, which is rather interesting because this is about those enormous clinical study reports that are produced from big drug trials. They're sometimes 800, 1,000 pages long with maybe 1 million data points. And this is a very interesting study where the authors, it's Peter Doshi and Tom Jefferson, looked at 75 of these great big reports, and they had got through various court cases and freedom of information requests, and they pored over them and looked to see how much information was in these reports and how much was in the corresponding papers that were published about those trials. And they described something called a compression factor, which is, you know, how much information is over here in the report and how much ends up in the paper. And sometimes this is compressed hundreds of times down to one little paper with 3 tables or something like that. So that's quite a useful paper, and they put their data set there. Again, I'm not working for Dryad or anything, but it's a terribly easy process, and that's just a screenshot of what you have to do. And when you're submitting your paper to BMJ Open, you can start the Dryad submission process at the same time, and you're given the option of, you know, where is your paper in the peer review process. And if your paper is rejected, then you can decide whether or not to go ahead and submit your data anyway, but you may want to wait until the paper has been published somewhere else, because the other journal that you go to next might not take too kindly to you having already put the raw data somewhere on the web freely accessible. Okay, quickly. I'm not getting into the technicalities of sharing data, not least because, a bit like David, I'm clueless about them. But not completely clueless, because I've been rather immersed in this and been to lots of workshops and so on, particularly in the last few months. However, if I spoke about it and you asked me questions, I'd be in trouble. I'm sticking to just a very, very brief discussion of the challenges when you're talking about sharing data, which actually are about the individual patients in studies. So, of course, the number one problem is that, for instance, how many of you are trialists? How many of you are starting clinical trials sometime in the next year or so? Okay, well, please, 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 when you design the consent form, don't just ask, would you be in this trial? You're going to get randomized to this or that intervention. Please also say, and we're going to publish articles about this trial. Some of those might be in an openly accessible journal. They may or may not, but if they are, lots of people can read them. They might get picked up in the press. And either we, or at some point in the future, either we will decide to share the actual anonymized data about you, or at some point in the future, some government might tell us we've got to do it, even retrospectively. So we'd quite like your permission now. And we've taken these steps to anonymize the data so that the risk of you being spotted in a data set is pretty small. How do you feel about that? Okay? Arguably, you should be getting that kind of consent from everybody in the trial. Not easy, but if you don't, I think you may find it pretty awkward in years to come. Things about this, you have to think about people's privacy, of course, and there are obviously all kinds of laws and ethics rules governing the privacy of the information of patients in the doctor-patient setting or in a study. Then there's what you do to anonymize or de-identify a data set. And increasingly, there's a very interesting body of work on the risk of re-identifying. And actually, I think that's probably the most useful. So for a given anonymized data set, there are now people looking at what are the chances of me finding somebody and re-identifying them because you put together this, and this information, and out they pop. And you can say the risk for this data set is this much on a scale of 1 to 10. And then you can judge whether or not that's a data set that should be released completely openly or if it should be released in some slightly restricted form. So there's lots of stuff around this. Other people say, well, it's great to have all the clinical data available for meta-analyses and further analyses, but what about the missing data in the trial? There are always missing data. What are we going to do about that? What were the original research questions? How do they relate to any reanalyses that people might want to do when they're reusing this? Will there be data dredging? Will people look at the data set, come up with the answers that they like, and then work backwards to a study question? Is that going to be a problem? There are lots of questions here. And then lastly, stuff around the usability of the data set. I've nearly finished now. You know about this because Ben told you. But this is just to reiterate why data sharing matters. And the All Trials petition, if you haven't signed it yet, does call for the individual patient level data to be made available. We heard earlier about these meta-analyses and why they're very important. And again, you want to get hold of these individual data. Well, the systematic reviewers doing these studies do manage to get the data on request from the authors of trials. But it isn't always that easy. Making the data sets available at patient level would make this endeavour much easier. The BMJ's got this campaign running at the moment, and one of the key planks of that is that since January this year, we are saying that anybody who submits a drug or devices trial to the BMJ, regardless of whether they're from industry or not, must commit on submission to making the patient level data available on reasonable request. That doesn't mean publicly available, and I'm happy to talk about that policy in more depth if anybody would like to ask me about it later. And then just quickly, there's the issue around missing data, which I mentioned, and we explored this in many articles and research studies in January 2012, and Ben mentioned one of the studies in his presentation earlier this morning by Prail and colleagues, looking at the very inadequate and incomplete registration of results on clinicaltrials.gov. That's just an example of a drug trial that's been published in BMJ Open, where not only have we got open peer review, but we've got the data. So it is possible, and this is a company-sponsored trial. Interesting. So there's one example. Now, this is an interesting endeavour, an interesting new thing, and publishers are beginning to launch journals which are called data journals, because they include articles which describe data sets. The data sets are somewhere else, they're in a repository somewhere, and these articles say, right, there's this data set, it exists, this is what's in it, this is how we put it together, here's the technical stuff you need to know, and here's what you need to know to go and use the data set. Rather fun. This is an archaeology journal which has just launched. They're charging 75 quid to publish these articles. They are peer reviewed, so they're not publishing all of them. And interestingly, one of the first papers they published happened to be sort of medical, which is quite fun. So maybe data articles are the next way forward. So there you are, you'll be doing a study, you'll be publishing papers about the study, you'll be publishing the data set, and then you'll be publishing articles about the data set. Hurrah! Lots of publications. And that's it. Thank you very much.